actually went to a school in West Philadelphia about 2 months ago, right around the beginning of the school year. And I walked into a kindergarten classroom, and the teacher was giving a lesson on uppercase and lowercase letter B. And so the kids are, they have their black crayons, and I'm wondering why everyone's hands are so smudged. And I looked down, and all of the kids are writing on newsprint because the teacher didn't have actual white paper or line paper to give to those students. And so we have a situation where we have 5-year-olds in school who have ink all over their hands, who are trying to make letters out on top of printed paper because of the resource gap. And so I think that when we start to teach little kids at 5 years old that you're not good enough to have paper, we end up with a society of folks who really believe that no one cares about them, that they aren't important, and that they're not worth an investment.
So that's the biggest challenges that kids here face, is because they have real life things to worry about. More often than not, they come from single families and they have a number of siblings, and so there's an idea that when you get to a certain age, you need to work to support the family. So as soon as you're 16 years old, you need to go out and what ends up happening is you have to determine what's more important: supporting my mother, my brother, my little sister, or going to school. And that's a tough choice. And you know what? Kids shouldn't have to make those choices. Kids should have these supports. These programs should be in place and well funded to help them get that education they need. So at the end of the day, we need to do a better job of supporting our city schools, because these kids need these supports more than kids in better off districts.
One of the things that we should be asking ourselves is, what opportunities do kids have? And when you are a Philly public school student and academically you weren't given a fair shot, and you don't have extracurricular activities, and there's no counselor to write you a letter of recommendation, we really are relegating students to a lower class of life.
You see the state of the way schools are right now, with not so many, clearly not enough nurses, clearly not enough counselors, clearly in some situations classrooms overcrowded. Then what do? Do you say, okay, well, we have to make sure that the teachers are paid at X level, and we can't do anything over here for the kids, or you do something for the kids, but then that hurts the teachers, which also in turn then hurts the kids. So those conversations go back and forth.
Class sizes have ballooned over the last few years here in Philadelphia. You have up to 40 students in a class, some cases 45 students in a class, where you start to wonder if even that's even safe in terms of a fire hazard. People don't have desks, they're using tables in the back of the room, things like that. In some schools in Philadelphia last year, and even to a certain degree this year, you have what's called split grades, where you have one teacher teaching a group of third graders for one part of the class and then teaching fourth graders for another part of the class. It's almost going back to the old days of like a one classroom school. And I don't understand how you can possibly expect kids to get a quality education if they're only really getting half an education. And so that's a situation that we're facing here in Philadelphia, and it's really sad.
Problem with Pennsylvania's funding is there's not a full, fair funding formula. Everybody is kind of left to their own devices. However many 500 and some school districts or some crazy number. So that's been basically done most of the way in Pennsylvania with property taxes. So if you live somewhere where places are worth a lot and you can charge people a lot for property tax, you have great funding. If you don't, then you don't. So many states, in fact, I think up into the 40s, the number of states that have a different kind of formula are just, they're a formula that says, here's how we're funding schools, we're dividing it equally, to each school district based on need, based on, sometimes they throw poverty rates into the equation. If you have a high poverty rate school, you need more support, or district. We need something more even across Pennsylvania, because the rural districts are having the same kind of issues as the urban districts are. There's not a lot of tax base anymore. There's a lot of issues of poverty, and they just can't fund the schools. So there's something that has to change in the fundamental way we fund schools in Pennsylvania. And there's a lot of suggestions for people to look at from all these other states that do it differently.
Pennsylvania is one of 3 states across the country that doesn't have a student-weighted, predictable, fair funding formula. And what's fair is largely debatable. That's why I put it in quotation marks.
When the state takes away $1 billion, or in Philadelphia's case, $300 million in 1 year, that will significantly impact a poor school district. Whereas a wealthy school district, like Hatboro Horsham, for example, 82% of the funding for their school district comes from the local tax base. So when the state cuts funding for education, it won't necessarily impact a wealthy district like Hatboro Horsham the way it'll impact a poor district like Philadelphia. And so it creates this, education based on where you live. So if you live in a poor neighborhood, chances are you're not going to get as good an education as if you just happen to live within the boundary lines of a wealthy school district.
So a lot of our work is centered around making sure that kids have the funding they need to attend quality schools. And so last year we launched a big campaign to ensure that there were no more cuts at the state level. Over the last 3 years, students have experienced unprecedented cuts. In 2011, the governor cut $1 billion from public education funding, and that resulted in the loss of thousands of teaching positions, programs being cut, counselors and nurses being laid off. And so we're actually in a situation where even here in Philadelphia, for a district of 130,000 students, we have 16 librarians to serve all those students. And essentially our line was, we need a funding formula, we need a common sense way to fund schools, and that our students deserve better.
The School Reform Commission is a 5-member panel with 3 commissioners from the state and 2 commissioners from the city that were put in charge of the Philadelphia School District back in 2001, specifically with the goal of trying to maintain the financial management of the district and turn around the academic performance of that school district.
So those people are what replaces a school board. Philadelphia, at least in modern history, never had an elected school board. We had an appointed school board. However, most people were happy, at least somewhat happy with it, because they were people from Philadelphia, they were Philadelphians. Oftentimes they were people who had been to school or taught in the Philadelphia schools, so there was some kind of community basis for their appointment. And oftentimes they were educators, not always. So the SRC is filled with a lot of, they always try to throw one educator or even a higher educator on there. They don't always stay, it doesn't always work. There have been a lot of configurations of the SRC over these last 13 or 14 years. There's usually a lawyer, a businessman in charge, or a politician, or all 3. Bill Green's currently in charge, and he's a former city councilman, a lawyer. Oftentimes people who didn't go to public school, didn't send their kids to public school, don't really know the issues that a real public schools have around funding and around educating everyone that comes in.
The school district is going to get so much money from the state, it's going to get so much money from the city. When that money is nowhere near what they need to actually provide an adequate education for all the kids in the city, there's a lot of tough choices that have to be made.
The biggest problem that the teachers and the teachers union has with the cancellation of the contract is that it's a completely undemocratic takeover that they did because they weren't getting what they wanted in negotiations. Even though they had basically stopped negotiating as of July and would refuse to see the negotiators, and they just went, we're done. Well, you can't, that's not really legal to say you're done if the other party still wants to negotiate.
Then take it from the union's perspective. You have teachers who have been paying out of pocket for supplies more and more over the past few years, people who are working, longer hours, picking up the slack of the other employees who were laid off or who left the district, people who have been thinking, I'm on the fence, why am I still in Philadelphia? I could take my years of experience and get a job in Lower Merion, maybe. And from their perspective, here's another thing that's just making it more difficult to be in the district. So you can kind of understand both sides.
Teachers in Philadelphia traditionally get paid less than anyone else in the 5-county area. And one of the things we had was a really good health plan. That was the perk of teaching for less money. So when you compare us to say, oh, well, Radnor teachers pay this much into their health care and Lower Merion teachers pay this much, yes, but they have a much higher base salary and a much higher average salary than we do. The figure they publicize to say, oh, it's only, $20-some a paycheck, that's for a single person with no family. For me, for example, if I were to keep the same insurance I have now, it would be over $8,000 a year.
So I left teaching after I realized that I wasn't doing any good despite my best efforts, after I realized that the need to work just to do your job, all the effort it took to collect supplies, all the effort it took to make sure that my kids showed up and were ready to learn, wasn't worth my health. And I think that what we see is that teachers leave for a lot of reasons, and many times that's not because of the kids. The kids have their issues, but as a teacher, that's what you sign up for. Teachers leave because of issues that are bigger than us, and I think that after my third year of collecting paper and lugging it to school, my third year of bringing water into the building because the water fountains didn't work, I think after that I was just tired. And I think if someone who comes from that environment can be exhausted, I can't imagine what it's like for someone who comes from an environment where school is school to work in those conditions. I think people have really been shaken by the budget cuts that have taken place. And so the governor who actually got rid of the funding formula has said our funding system is broken despite the fact that he broke the funding formula. And so I think that Tom Wolf and Tom Corbett have both said that they support a funding formula. We're currently the only state that doesn't have, we're one of 3 states that doesn't have a funding formula. They say that they support universal pre-K and access to pre-K. So this has really come down to a referendum on the governor's choices around education. And I think that we're really hopeful that no matter who gets elected, they will see the error of the last 4 years and make a difference for kids.
So every school in Pennsylvania is given a school performance profile, and this is a combination of factors that go into this, but primarily the biggest factor that drives a school's score on their school performance profile is their test scores of their students. And so there's been some analysis that's shown really that those school performance profiles are really directly correlated to the kinds of students that the schools have to begin with. So in other words, if a school has lots of students who are in deep poverty, lots of students who are experiencing trauma, students in the foster care system, students in the delinquency, the juvenile delinquency system, students who have experienced homelessness, students who are severe disabilities, students who are learning English, that their school performance profiles, this might not sound that earth-shattering, but those school performance profiles are lower for schools that have high numbers of those students. Which is not that shocking, but it does mean that we are essentially as a state saying that if you have those high populations of students, that you're not a good school. That's the way we're measuring what is a good school and a bad school. And we've found that troubling, because if schools are told that in order to be a good school, you've got to serve these kinds of students, then they have incentives, perverse incentives, to actually deny certain kinds of students from getting into their schools, or to push out certain kinds of students from getting into their schools. Philadelphia schools are asked to do a lot. We have a student population with very, very extensive needs. We have over 80% of our students are what we consider economically disadvantaged. But even more troubling than that is that we have the highest deep poverty rate. So higher than any other big city. Are the numbers of our students that are living in deep poverty. We have huge numbers of students that we say are system involved. So what we mean by that is students who are connected to the delinquency system for criminal behavior, or in the dependency system because of abuse or neglect that they've been experiencing in their home environments. So we have schools that we're asking to take students that are in a concentrated way in these schools and provide them with a quality education. That takes a lot more resources to do that effectively. In contrast, we have a sort of very backward system in Pennsylvania, because the schools that have the least numbers of vulnerable at-risk students have the best resources to provide them with a public education. And the schools that have the most concentrations of those students have the least resources.
So while how we talked about how Pennsylvania has failed to invest in its schools, where it has invested is in its prisons. We have actually increased prison spending since we've had a new governor, and it's actually kind of smart because countless studies actually show that children who do not get a good education, who do not graduate, they are more likely to be incarcerated.
The school to prison pipeline is an evocative sort of metaphor for what many people have seen happening with students that are placed into schools that are not resourced to either resourced properly to provide them with what they need, or that are just simply not doing the work that they need to do to meet the needs of those students. We know when students are excluded from school, we call this exclusionary discipline, things like suspensions and expulsions, transfers to what we call disciplinary schools or alternative education programs, that those students statistically are more likely to have future encounters with the criminal justice system. Quite literally, those students are more likely to end up in prison.
And one of the things that we advocate so strongly about here is investing in education, but also investing in early education. Because when states determine how they're going to build a prison, they have to determine how many cells they need, how much seats they need. And the sole place where they look to determine is they look at current third grade reading levels. Because it is well known that if children are not reading on grade level by the end of the third grade, they are more likely than not going to end up dropping out of school. And they're going to end kids, as I just said, as kids drop out of school, they're more likely to commit crimes and be incarcerated. If you're not going to invest in education, well then I guess you have to invest in prisons because that's where your kids are going to end up. And of course what we need to do is we need to reverse that cycle so that we're investing in education so that more children graduate, they grow up healthy, they're successful, and then we don't need to worry about them going to prison.
A lot of people like to question whether money matters. A lot of people will say, we can throw money at the problem and that's not going to solve the problem. And of course it's true that additional money on its own doesn't necessarily solve anything, but we do know that adequate resources are a prerequisite, that we can't have fair and equitable and adequate public education if we don't have sufficient resources. We need to ensure, of course, that our schools are doing the right things, that they're using best practices, that they're hiring good teachers, and they're getting the training and the professional development that they need to adequately serve these students. But we also know that that's not going to happen if we're continuing to starve our schools from having adequate funding.
The solution here is to finally fix this problem is for Pennsylvania to enact a fair funding formula. If we at least know, we have a predictable system that is based on the actual cost of providing quality education for children, then school districts everywhere, not just Philadelphia, but everywhere, can start to plan their school budgets. And so they can start to say, all right, cool, we're going to hire a dance teacher from Kensington Kappa. We're going to hire an extra guidance counselor so kids can get their recommendation letters. We can plan to have a school nurse because we know that this funding will be coming. And they can plan 5 years in advance even if they want to and say, in year 3, then we'll have this much. In year 4, we'll have this much. If we can do that, then we start to move the ball forward. Then we can start talking about curriculum. We can talk about ways that we can take the great resources that we have and actually make sure they're being used properly so kids are actually getting that good education that they need to succeed. And that's really what it's going to come down to is fair funding.